Chapter 2, Albert Priddy. And just to make a comment before I read this, it's always a freaking Albert working with, like, creepy industrialization of, like, genetic warfare. Alright. In the summer of 1924, Dr. Albert Priddy was in his 14th year as a superintendent of Virginia's colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. The superintendent of the Virginia State Hospital in the 1920s was a combination of a chief medical officer, chief executive officer, and plantation master. Dr. Priddy was the colony's first superintendent, was all three things. He was also something else, a social reformer with a keen vision of the role he wanted the colony to play in improving society. Dr. Priddy was a man of science who had dedicated his life to mental health. His institution housed many people with mental disabilities and epilepsy, and it was a source of frustration to him that although there was therapies and regimens that could help, there was no cure for his inmates' mental disabilities. At the start of the 20th century, however, the rapidly growing eugenics movement promised something even better than a cure, a way of ensuring that over time the conditions he was working to treat would completely disappear, and future generations would not suffer from them. The answer to feeble-mindedness, as Dr. Priddy saw it, lay not in treating the condition, but improving the gene pool and rooting out its hereditary basis. In many states, doctors were among the first to be drawn to eugenics because they were closest to the problems of disease and defect, and they saw it as their responsibility to find a cure. Dr. Priddy was one of these pioneers among the earliest people in Virginia to advocate the state eugenic policies to stamp out feeble-mindedness. Dr. Priddy believed in one policy in particular, eugenic sterilization, which he was convinced could become quickly and permanently cut off mental defects at its source. By the 1920s, many people across the country had come to support sterilization, and more than a dozen states had adopted legislation to carry it out. Dr. Priddy had made it his mission to bring this eugenic cure to Virginia, and because of the position he had risen to in the state medical establishment and the tenacity with which he pursued his goals, he was in a good position to get his way. Albert Sidney Priddy was born on December 7, 1865, on a farm in Lunenburg County, southeast of Lynchburg. By the way, I haven't commented on this yet, but Lynchburg, really? Oof, Jesus Christ. The Civil War had ended just 8 months earlier, when General Robert Ely surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, about 50 miles from the Priddy farm. The Priddys soon moved to nearby Charlotte County, and it was there that Albert spent his childhood as one of the large farming family of 9. Young Albert began his education in a small town of Keysville in a 4-room schoolhouse with the lofty name of Shotwell Institute. When he exhausted the local educational opportunities, Albert, a gifted and driven student, traveled north to Baltimore to enroll in its newly established College of Physicians and Surgeons. He graduated in 1886, becoming a medical doctor at the age of 20. Dr. Priddy returned to Keysville and established a practice. Despite his relative isolation, he followed medical advances at the research hospitals in the big cities and overseas, particularly in his specialty of surgery. Dr. Priddy integrated the latest procedures into his own medical work. In 1888, he performed one of the earliest successful operations for performing surgery of the intestines. Despite having a thriving medical practice, Dr. Priddy was drawn to politics. He was elected to the Virginian House of Delegates, and while still treating patients, he represented Charlotte County, which contained Keysville, from 1893 to 1894, and began from 1899 to 1900. Dr. Priddy was a progressive force in the legislature. He helped draft a law requiring a secret ballot in Virginia elections, an important advance for the forces fighting political corruption in the state. Dr. Priddy was also an advocate for an issue that was gaining attention in state houses nationwide: improved cure for the mentally ill. He arrived in the legislature at the start of the Progressive Era, a period of idealistic social reform in many areas, including mental health. The Progressive Era had faith that state hospitals, if properly constituted, could make great strides in treatment. As a legislator, Dr. Priddy became a leading advocate for reforming the governments of the state hospitals for the insane. When his final term in the House of Delegates ended, Dr. Priddy decided to return to the practice of medicine. His professional interest had turned to mental health, with an emphasis on reforming the way in which the mentally ill were cared for. Dr. Priddy closed up his medical office in Keysville and accepted a position at the Southern Western Lunatic Asylum in Marion, the newest of Virginia's mental health hospitals. Virginia was not a leader on many social issues in the 1920s, but it had historically been a pioneer in mental health. In colonial times, the mentally ill were generally kept in almsville houses or jails, or simply left to fend for themselves. The British governor of Virginia colony, Francis Farquhar, who was the son of the Huguenot physician, believed more should be done for them. He proposed that, quote, a hospital be constructed for the lunatics and idiots wandering helplessly around the country, end quote. The House of Burgesses agreed, and in 1773, the public hospital for persons of insane and disordered mind opened in Williamsburg. It was the first hospital for the mentally ill in the United States, older than the nation itself. The hospitals in Williamsburg, later renamed itself the State Hospitals, was Virginia's only hospital for the mentally ill until 1828, when the Western Lunatic Asylum, later called Western State Hospital, was established in the Shenandoah Valley. The third hospital, the Southwestern Lunatic Asylum, later called Southwestern State Hospital, was opened in 1887 in Marion. After the Civil War, Virginia established a separate hospital for mentally ill blacks, a central lunatic asylum which was later renamed the Central State Hospital for Negroes. There was now mental hospitals in every part of Virginia, but the state had no hospitals for another group that needed special care: epileptics. Epilepsy was little understood at the time. The medical profession was just starting to move away from ancient prejudices, including the belief that epileptics were possessed by the devil, but it was discovering a treatment to suppress seizures. Across the nation, interest was growing in treating new institutions for epileptics based on the colony model.